Let us now speak of Lysander Spooner. This dude, um, American individualist, uh, in some ways the most pointed and extreme, uh, the most hectoring, pounding individualist anarchist, but also the most sort of maybe the most polemically pointed, sophisticated in some ways. The arguments are, I mean, they can't be gainsaid. He's a killer. He's a killer arguer. Now he only has a few arguments, and he repeats them over and over again in various contexts. Actually, I guess that's not true if you look at the whole authorship. But the sort of anarchist individualist stuff leans very heavily on a couple of arguments. And um, I guess what I said early on is that I think Spooner and Kropotkin are the two greatest anarchist thinkers up until Graeber and Scott in '90s and thousands. Um, and I mean, Spooner has his limitations and has his limitations as a writer, but he's extremely plausible as an arguer. I mean, in a way, the pounding repetition of it doesn't enhance its plausibility. Um, but like I say, I don't think the arguments can be gainsaid in a way. And all right, so it's an interesting life, 1808 to 1880s, um, and he started as, I mean, we could talk about several things with him. He started wanting to be a lawyer in Massachusetts. He was from Massachusetts, Athol, Massachusetts, I think, Boston area. Um, Massachusetts required a 5-year apprenticeship to become a attorney at in the early 19th century, and Spooner filed a series of lawsuits and issued a series of polemics, arguing that this was un-American and that anyone should be able to set up as a lawyer at their own risk and their own expense. Okay, and if they can attract clients and get a track record as a lawyer, that's good enough. This place was not infested with law schools then. Um, so that I mean, so here, first of all, he's an anarchist lawyer. He's like and there are a few more serious and actually sophisticated legal scholars in American history than Lysander Spooner, which is wild. Like, as a law expert who's an anarchist and whose arguments always kind of come from a lawyerly place. Right? He wrote a book, and this is how he sort of became known to a somewhat broader public, called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. So he's a major abolitionist. He's an opponent of the Garrisonians and maybe the Thoreauvians too, in this way, but Garrison in particular, who's also an anarchist. William Lloyd Garrison is a religious anti-statist. He's like, we can recognize the legitimacy of no government. That's William Lloyd Garrison in his pacifist expression. And Garrison argued that the Constitution was an illegitimate, or he called it a pact with the devil, because he said it recognized slavery in multiple ways. Maybe you're familiar with this as a constitutional question or a point about the Constitution, just that maybe a pretty undoubted point that it recognizes slavery. Right? It recognizes the slave trade and prohibits people from banning it for some years. Okay, the 3/5 clause and for congressional representation and so on. All right, but Spooner, and so Garrison called the Constitution a pact with the devil. He said no decent person can recognize this document as long as it in turn recognizes slavery. And he burned copies of the Constitution. I think we've already talked about the Anthony Burns case, the fugitive slave in Massachusetts. Like I say, Garrison called the Constitution a pact with the devil. Now, Spooner gives a series of ingenious arguments, killer arguments, really, that slavery is totally unconstitutional. Actually, I think Garrison is right. Implicitly, without saying the word slave, the Constitution does recognize slavery. Spooner's arguments are remarkable, though. And, basically it's this, look at the whole document, man. It recognizes a whole bunch of individual rights, right? It doesn't say black people don't have these rights or whatever. The whole Constitution is totally incompatible with slavery, he says. The whole spirit of the document. And Lord, he's got a point, right? And then he develops, and actually some recent Supreme Court decisions, people like Scalia and Thomas have quoted Lysander Spooner. All right, he has a theory of constitutional and legal interpretation, which he gives in the unconstitutionality of slavery. And it's powerful. He doesn't think that the Constitution means what the founders intended it to mean. And he says that what the founders may have intended, sometimes you can sort of get some picture of that from surrounding documents and accounts and so on. But what are we doing? Reading people's minds? The Constitution means what it says. The plain sense of the words. Okay? And, he's writing this maybe 50 years after the Constitution's ratification. And, maybe there's less brutal disagreement about the meaning of the Constitution in some ways. But, when he says, okay, the First Amendment, is there any limitation on who that applies to within the borders of the United States? Absolutely not. So slaves have free speech, free expression, free exercise of religion, freedom to assemble, right? All this stuff, all right? But the Bill of Rights is, at least the whole system is completely incompatible with slavery. The plain sense of the words of the document. Yes, it does matter that it doesn't say slave. That affects the sense of the document profoundly. So he's killing it. It's a long and pretty convincing thing. And lots of abolitionists really appreciate this because Garrison was so far on the radical tip. He's an anarchist. He's a religious fanatic, really. Okay, Jesus freak or something, Garrison. And he doesn't think that abolitionists should participate in politics at all. But meanwhile, abolitionist political parties are rising, and they take Spooner's thing to be a comfort, and a program. Elect us, the Constitution, we will enforce the Constitution, which will end slavery. Here's Spooner's argument. Now, Spooner didn't support voting. Spooner didn't support political parties, all right? Spooner didn't think that. Spooner thought that the election of Abraham Lincoln was completely illegitimate, but he thought all American elections were completely illegitimate. So, and furthermore, and this is wild, okay, he defended the right of secession. He's the most anti-slavery person you ever saw. Slavery is incompatible with his every ethical and political insight. But he defends the right of secession, and he's one of the few abolitionists to do so, even though any of these abolitionist anti-statists could have been brought along that way, so anyone has a right to secede from any government at any time. Thoreau said something like this too. And then Garrison suggested the secession of the free states from the slave states. Right? But what he makes of the Civil War is really complex, okay? But it comes from his incredibly simple, straightforward set of political commitments. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the good texts are in this Lysander Spooner reader, although not, there's a bunch of trial by jury is another, he argues that, trial by jury is an argument by this incredibly sophisticated legal thinker, anarchist, for jury nullification as compatible with the Constitution and as having its source in English common law, and that can be proven. Jury nullification, relevant more recently in enforcing drug prohibitions and so on. That is, juries not only saying this person is not guilty of violating that law, but saying that that law should not be enforced or it's illegitimate. And again, this has an anarchist oomph, but it has a legal thing going on. It's a pretty vast oeuvre, and I recommend, which still exists, a site called lysanderspooner.org. And I think it's put together partly by Randy Barnett, the major libertarian legal thinker of recent decades. And it has his whole oeuvre, basically, and it's kind of vast. He did things like he wrote book-length letters to politicians. Like I think there's one to Grover Cleveland about the illegitimacy of his election and inauguration. And it more or less is a book-length thing, unless I'm getting confused with another one. He wrote a lot. Right. Now, I guess the one text that I will consider here, or that I'll focus on, is one called, and by acclamation, it's maybe his basic text, No Treason. And he's arguing that can be no treason against the government of the United States as currently constituted, which would have the amazing, this is 1870, and so one argument would be that the Southern secessionists were not traitors, because it's impossible to be a traitor to the United States government, because the United States government is totally illegitimate, according to Lysander Spooner. Now, is he defending Southern rebels? Yes. Is he as opposed to slavery as anyone that has ever existed? Yes. And he thinks that's for the same reasons. The same reason that the Southern rebels do have a right to secede from the Union is the same reason that a slave has a right to secede from their plantation, dude. Or from this society that enslaves them. So here's the essence of Lysander Spooner. Taking American values, the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, Lockean liberalism, and driving it all the way to anarchism. Proving that if you're a classical liberal, if you have the basic values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, then you are rationally obliged real quick and real hard to be an anarchist. So now that's an interesting claim. And like I say, I think he proves it, in spades or whatever, over and over and over again. And it's a certain way into anarchism that the Europeans don't have. Okay, Bakunin can't get into anarchism this way. Like, here are the basic national values that more or less we all endorse. And actually they entail anarchism. I don't think you can do that with monarchism, right? The aristocratic systems or the theocratic systems or whatever. But his appeal is to an American consciousness, and he expects these arguments to have considerable purchase in the minds of Americans. This is one reason that American anarchism and European anarchism are quite different until they merge around 1900 or 1880s, 90s. Because they come from different political traditions with different, rhetorical moves that people will recognize and or acknowledge and stuff like this. All right. I mean, so a lot of American individualist anarchism arises to a large extent by taking the values of the founding and driving them a little farther. Okay. Josiah Warren was just like that. He said, "These are the values of Jefferson, man." Okay. And Josiah Warren called himself a Democrat. And I think Spooner does similarly. Not an anarchist. And Warren held that his values were just an extension, a direct, obvious extension of the basic American values of the founding, the revolution and the founding. And Spooner, in a lot of ways, just proves that. So in No Treason, he destroys social contract theory. It's one of the great... Social contract theory has been destroyed so many times from so many angles. An early example is David Hume, who just killed it, dude, like on a lot of the same grounds. But Spooner, it's okay. People have inherent, natural, unalienable rights. Okay. Then government by coercion is illegitimate. All right. The legitimacy of government, on the account that we all accept here, we Americans, whatever, legitimacy of government rests on the consent of the governed. That's his real lever in, the consent of the governed. All right, so anarchism follows. It does, doesn't it? Right? I just go like, I don't consent. And Thoreau did the same thing, and he did it, Thoreau did it in a sentence or two. It's like, know by these presents that I, Henry Thoreau, do not want to be, withdraw my membership from every organization that I haven't joined. I don't consent, he says. And Spooner does this like at a books coming one after the other, man. Like, if you think the legitimacy of government rests on the consent of the governed, and we all agree on that, anarchism follows like boink. Or like this, like you can only countenance a voluntary, non-coercive government. So you can't countenance a political state. All right, let's do some passages. So one thing he points out, he's undermining the legitimacy of the United States government. The number which says that the legitimacy of government rests on the consent of the governed. The number who actually consented to the Constitution of the United States at the first was very small. Considered as the act of the whole people, the adoption of the Constitution was the merest farce and imposture, binding on nobody. That's Lysander Spooner's tone. The merest farce and imposture. The women, children, and blacks, of course, were not asked to give their consent. So, I mean, this is something that much later progressives might say, right? It's like, who actually did put together the Constitution? Well, these land-owning white men, period. He says that over and over again, okay? And he says that just makes it illegitimate. I mean, most of the people did not even pretend to consent, okay? Because they were all, they had, in addition to this, there were, in nearly or quite all the states, property qualifications that excluded probably 1/2 or 2/3 or perhaps even 3/4 of the white male adults from the right of suffrage. And those who were allowed that right, we know not how many exercised it. Furthermore, those who originally agreed to the Constitution could thereby bind nobody that should come after them. I mean, this should be a completely familiar point. Like, I can't consent on behalf of my descendants. In fact, I can't consent with regard to anybody unless I have a legal instrument giving me their power of attorney or something like that. They could contract for no one but themselves. They had no more natural right or power to make political contracts binding upon succeeding generations than they had to make marriage or business contracts binding on them. In truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting, well, okay, maybe I'll skip that one. All right, so look, it rests on the consent of the government, but most people didn't consent. And almost no living people have consented. And as I've argued, it's by definition impossible to consent to a overwhelming coercive force that's in your face. You can't make a contract under those situations. You can't make a free choice. Right? So my view is that no one has consented to the government of the United States. No one has consented. It's literally impossible to consent to the government to be ruled by the government of the United States, which is an overwhelming coercive force. I am not free not to consent. So I'm not free to consent. So I have not consented. I do not consent. So okay, that's the case. What does the legitimacy of the United States government rest on? And his answer is not anything. Not at all. Not even close. Not even a little. And again, like the appeal to American values is very pointed. No middle ground is possible on this subject, he says. This is section 7 of No Treason. Either taxation without consent is robbery, or it is not. If it is not, then any number of men who choose may at any time associate, call themselves a government, assume absolute authority over all weaker than themselves, plunder them at will, and kill them if they resist. If taxation without consent is permissible, then men who choose may at any time associate, call themselves a government, this is exactly what he thinks is the origin of all governments, assume absolute authority over all weaker than themselves, plunder them at will, and kill them if they resist. If, on the other hand, taxation without consent is robbery, it necessarily follows that every man who has not consented to be taxed has the same natural right to defend his property against a tax gatherer that he has to defend it against the highwayman. And it's amazing what you read in Spooner. Like, he should have expected to be repressed. I don't know how he kept going. You know, he is constantly referring to the president as a tyrant. Highwaymen, robbers, organized crime syndicates, etc. He hates government above all. We have a government, state and national, devoted to nearly every grade and species of crime that governments have ever practiced upon their victims. And these crimes have culminated in a war, the Civil War, that has cost 1 million lives, a war carried on upon one side for chattel slavery, and on the other side for political slavery, that is statism. And the U.S. government grew and grew in power extremely right here at the Civil War. Upon neither the Confederate States nor the United States of America, for liberty, justice, or truth. And these crimes have been committed, and this war waged by men and the descendants of men who less than 100 years ago said that all men were equal and could owe neither service to individuals nor allegiance to governments except by their own consent. We've come very, very far from that, haven't we? All right. I guess there's many more passages I could read and many more things I could say about Lysander Spooner. But it's a particular kind of argument. And if you don't accept the basic setup or the basic set of political values that we might associate with America, if okay, I mean, here's what I want to say. I mean, here's what Lysander Spooner really does. Natural rights. He puts everything on the concept of natural rights, taken from Locke or even Aquinas and so on, of natural law and stuff like this. He says he doesn't recognize any law except natural law. He's an atheist, though, or deist. He says he doesn't recognize any rights except natural rights, that the nature is the source of rights. And, I mean, we have each of us equally has an inherent set of natural rights that it is evil to violate. Now, in thousands of pages, Lysander Spooner proves that is completely incompatible with coercive government. But I will say this, it's obvious that it's incompatible with coercive government, man. You don't even need the arguments. It's once you define a government, once you see clearly what a government is, if you accept a doctrine of unalienable natural rights, you cannot countenance human government, okay? Not at all. And this is a very antinomian position. It's quite like Anne Hutchinson or something like that, or Roger Williams. Like, it's an antinomian position, but it has no God going on, right? It's just like, and the higher power, though, is nature or something like this, okay? Or the natural situation, or the light of reason, which shows us that we are all equal and that we all have the same package of inherent natural rights. And if you admit that, then you are rationally obliged to be an anarchist. And I say he shows that 1,000 times, okay? Like, just directly, and and with very elaborate arguments and many examples, okay? But you basically don't need the arguments and examples. You need them to try to persuade. Although he's such a hectoring pounder that he maybe doesn't really persuade. Even if you should be persuaded. You're rationally obliged to be persuaded, but you're liable to be more irritated. At any rate, as a demonstration that classical liberalism, or a set of American values, leads directly to anti-statism, Spooner is perfect, like totally destructive. He does the job completely convincingly, hundreds of times, all right? Now, that's only one way into anarchism, and if you don't accept the first few premises, if Lockean liberalism has no appeal to you because you're a proletariat or a communist theorist later in the century, you wouldn't have to go down this road at all. Like, without the premises of equal natural rights, which he appeals to as a kind of bottom line, but that's going to be the only way you squirrel out of this American individualist anarchism. You're going to have to deny that people have equal, unalienable rights. Go ahead, and if you're a statist, if you endorse the existence of the political state, you do reject that anyway. Like, I mean, you might yip-yap it, but you don't think people have equal, unalienable natural rights. You think they ought to be coerced and violated by this legitimate organization due to a social contract or whatever. Now, the social contract has been totally destroyed one more time, and the entailments have finally been stated. Like, okay, so you don't believe what you're saying about equal rights, or you're an anarchist. He killed it. He did it. Lysander Spooner. Very impressive beard, too.